as I've been practicing social work, I've been integrating my social work skills and research into doing some user research. I've contributed to some research for Kat Small's thesis called Sense You, which is a game that teaches about body positivity and sex education. And I am also about to start being a social worker at Tech Kids Unlimited, which teaches children on the autism spectrum how to use digital media applications. And I also play lots of video games.
Video games?
They're pretty great.
Awesome. So we are going to be talking about a couple of things, all related to games, the human experience, emotions, and mental health. So firstly, we're going to talk about the current landscape of emotions, mental health, empathy in games. Then we're going to talk about how to incorporate these kinds of concepts into your games that you might be working on, or if you've ever kind of wanted to critically analyze games for these kinds of aspects that can also be applied to that. And then we're also going to just discuss a couple of steps that you can kind of go through next to continue learning, like recommendations regarding games to play, as well as some books and different articles from journals to read. And then afterward, we'll have a lot of time for Q&A, so you can prepare any questions that you might have and then get your fingers ready for raising the trigger happy fingers. Awesome.
Great, yeah, so I just want to talk to you guys a little bit about the current landscape of video games, and particularly in mental health. Recently, within the past 10 years, actually, there have been a huge development in figuring out how video games can benefit our brains and making video games for the specific benefit for your brains and for mental health. And so I'm sure you've heard of lots of these games like Portal 2 and Super Mario Sunshine. All those games really increase your cognitive abilities such as spatial skills and creativity. There have been a lot of experimental studies that have shown that some video games increase pro-social behavior in terms of problem solving together. And yeah, video games are really good for you.
And that reflex, they definitely help.
Yes.
Reflex.
Reflexes, definitely. And there are also video games now that are being specifically designed to address people's mental health needs, such as Virtually Better's virtual reality cognitive behavioral therapy. And essentially, if you haven't heard of CBT, it's one of the widest practiced modalities in the United States. It's an evidence-based practice, meaning that we have tested it and shown that it significantly improves people's depressive symptoms. It's used for anxiety. And here you can see a GIF of a session going on right now for a woman who has anxiety around public speaking, and also for kids, anxiety in terms of talking to their peers. And there are also some virtual simulations for soldiers undergoing PTSD symptoms. Some really cool stuff. And there's some other really cool games out there as well, such as this game called Sparks, which essentially teaches CBD techniques to teenagers and adolescents. And so the really objective of these games is to make mental health more fun to talk about and to learn about, and to make it more engaging and accessible to both children and adults.
Yeah, and another way that people have been kind of like focusing on mental health and emotion in games is actually through just the concepts that people are conveying in their games. So this right here is actually a shot from That Dragon Cancer, which is a new game that kind of talks about the experience of having a child with cancer and supporting that child. And just what it's like to be in that role. So a lot of people are starting to make games that are more about their own experiences, and in some ways, sometimes they're like more autobiographical, but sometimes they're definitely more fantasy driven. So it's really interesting to not only see what people are doing in the research space and in the therapy space, but also what people are doing in terms of like just the more, I guess, indie scene, or like the other part of game development.
You will feel so many feels playing this game.
You will cry.
Like actually though.
All the time.
It's great, but also scary.
So, now that we've kind of like laid the landscape a little bit, we're going to talk about some different tips for game design, just regarding like all kinds of aspects.
Right, so there's some games that you're going to want to ask yourself before even, putting that first line of code or, your first prototype. You want to figure out, what's the purpose of your game? Like, why are you making this game? Do you want to make people laugh? Do you want to make people throw their controller to the ground? You know, you really got to figure out, like, why am I doing this for myself? Am I doing it for other people? Like, what is the purpose of this game? And who's your target audience? You know, who are you making this for? You really got to figure out, like, do I want to make this game for a general audience? Do I want to target this at a specific population? And if you are doing a specific population, is it sensitive to that population's needs? You really have to figure that out. And how do you want people to feel when they're playing this game? You know, games are becoming, since Pong, games have become a lot more complex in terms of dialogue, the environment sounds, all of these mechanics that we're going to be talking about a little bit later. And so you really want to have a concrete idea of the kinds of feelings and emotions you really want to elicit from your players. And so finally, this is kind of like a bigger life question, like, how will this game influence your player's life? I mean, what? I mean, there are some video games out there that have really changed, you know, our personalities, like who we are, how we interact with other people. I know when I started playing Minecraft, I would try to punch things in order to, like, make what? No, really. But no, there are a lot of games that really change, you know, my outlook on life, and so, you know, it's something to think about.
So a really great time to do this is, obviously you want to do this up front, and a really good method for this is by creating, a lot of people when they start making a game, they create a game design document. So that can be like a written piece of paper, it can be a Google Doc or something, just something that kind of answers these questions and also answers other things like what are the characters in the game, and what's the environment like, and what's the narrative. All those kinds of questions should be answered. So when you're creating a game design document, you can actually answer these questions at the same time, and then you can actually come back later to it and keep referencing it and question yourself and say, are these still things that are happening in my game?
And so, kind of to start answering these questions, one of the first things you really need to do is do your research. You're really, in order to immerse your players into your games, you have to figure out, you know, what makes them tick, what makes them want to hold on to the controller for another 30 minutes and stay immersed in your world. The kind of research you might do is, you know, you might do informal interviews with your friends and with your friends' friends, try to figure out, you know, what they look for in a game, or, you know, pitch an idea to them and see what their thoughts and feelings are about it. You might want to look at some journal and research articles and even news articles about similar games or different types of feelings and mechanics that are going to make your game different and immersive. And just reading books and media and watching movies and TV shows to see how other people are, you know, having a take on the character that you might be interested in, and you might want to do something very similar or do something completely different.
Yeah. A good example for just like context is so my thesis project that Laura mentioned earlier. It's a game that you know, it's like educational, but I really didn't want it to like be a slam kids in the head and say drugs are bad kind of educational thing. I wanted to make sure it was like something that they felt like they could relate to and trust and grow into and feel comfortable with. So I did a lot of research just around like the ways that people are teaching kids about sex and different things like that. And so by kind of looking those things up, also just understanding and testing with people and saying like, how do you, like, what kinds of games do you like that teach you things? Those kinds of questions were really useful for people to answer. So just talking to other people is incredibly important, and also when you're doing testing, just trying to have like normal, comfortable conversations with them, and try not to lead them, let them kind of answer, you know, in however way it makes them feel most comfortable. And then also just make sure that you take that feedback and actually try to apply it in a way that helps your game in the best way possible.
And it definitely goes for game testing as well. You know, once you do have the game and you're showing it to other people, let people experience it for themselves. You know, if you see them struggling, let them try to figure it out on their own before, you know, you let your biases influence their biases. And just let people try to figure it out on their own and see how they work with it. And also really important, when you do interviews with your target population, make sure it's actually your target population, because there's some games that have been designed. This is a big don't do that. You are
the worst.
bad person.
It's a really terrible, and so, okay. So if you haven't heard of Playing History 2 Slave Trade, it's a game that caused a huge controversy because of the singular level that people ended up calling like slave Tetris, in which you're supposed to be putting as many, people into a boat as possible so they can go to different countries. And people, there's so many problems with this. Like, it's really, like, how could you release this without, like, how can you not have gotten somebody to say this is bad? And you just know that they did not test this with enough people, because they would have found that out pretty quickly. So this is an example that is a real game that was released like this past year.
Yeah, really.
So quite recent.
Quite recently.
And you can this is an example of why research needs to be done, why you need to test your game with as many people as possible from within your target audience, and sometimes even without it, just so that you can catch mistakes like this entire level.
And to figure out like what's the best way to communicate your message. I mean, I've definitely seen documentaries about the slave trade, how obviously terrible it is. And, these people clearly, I guess they probably had good intentions and were like, oh, we want to teach kids about how horrible slavery was.
Look at their faces, they're so sad. Come on.
But that's not the way to do it.
No, so don't do that.
Don't do that. You're a horrible person if you do that. This is a slightly better example. GTA 4, as many of you probably played, as well as the other games in the GTA series, Rockstar does a really great job of creating an immersive environment for their players. I mean, first of all, just look at that map. Like, it's absolutely amazing, mimicking the various grid systems of New York City. And there's just so much exploration, and I love the different radio stations you can tune into that really change, the mood of the game. And the character development of Nico is really quite incredible. Kind of like living up to the American dream, and then it all kind of like gets drowned away by guns and violence. But on the flip side, they don't do a very good job in terms of representing women in their video games. A lot of women in their video games are represented as, sexual objects and don't really have any say or agency in these kinds of games. And so again, clearly, they have a target audience. Maybe one day they'll widen that target audience. And so it's kind of like two sides of the coin. They did a really good job on the environment and music and, some character development, but they definitely could do a little bit more work on integrating more women with agency.
Yes. So another thing to think about when you're making a game is that you've got mechanics, right? And so mechanics and rules are kind of like the systems that are in your game that kind of depict what a character can and can't do and what happens when a character does something. So you can actually use mechanics to convey different information. So an interesting example of a game that uses mechanics to kind of convey a feeling or an experience is Depression Quest. And so a lot of you have probably heard about Depression Quest. It's a really interesting, like interactive nonfiction kind of game where you learn what it's like to be a person who's living with depression. And obviously, a game that's text-based may not be able to 100% communicate what it's like to live with depression. But the mechanic of having these different options and then having some of them crossed out to show that the person knows that they can do them, but they just can't because it's just not, it doesn't feel possible for them, is very interesting. And I think this is an example that really very clearly conveys the point and like the experience very well.
Like a sense of helplessness.
Exactly.
You have all these options. Your friends are telling you, oh, you just pull yourself out of it. No, I can't do that. I don't have the energy to do that. Maybe you should try going back to sleep. Oh no, but these thoughts in my head are just really, taking up all of this memory and just can't allocate the way that another brain would.
Yeah, like it's a really, and I think for a lot of people this kind of like opened their eyes a little bit, even though it's a text game. So for example, like this is a great example of you don't really need like imagery and sound. Sometimes it can be as simple as just having a text game where you've got different options and you're using those mechanics to kind of show, an experience. So definitely a good thing to note. Additionally, lighting, color, illustration, visuals, imagery can all help to convey an emotion. So the reason that this is here is, I don't know if any of y'all have heard of color theory, for example, but people react differently to different colors. So for example, a lot of websites like blue, because blue is supposed to be a calm color that makes you feel like you trust them.
We're so calming and trusting.
Yeah,
blue.
look at us.
We know what we're talking about.
Hopefully we seem official and cool. Yes, we might be pregnant. No, sorry. Continuing forward. So a game that does this very interestingly is Contrast. I don't know if any of y'all have played it, but I believe it's available for the PS4. It's a very interesting experience. You are playing as this questionably real character who might be an imaginary character of the girl that you see here. And so the girl herself is kind of experiencing a lot. Like her mother is like working at all times of the night, trying to like pay for room and board. Her father is kind of in and out, and they don't know if he's actually her father. And there's a lot of like dramatic stuff going on. And so it's really interesting the choices that they made in terms of the color, the lighting, the mood, and everything really helped to kind of underscore this this kind of time period in this little girl's life. The other interesting thing is also like the time period they kind of chose. I believe it was around like maybe the 1950s or so, but it was definitely like set in a very fantasy world. But at the same time, like there are parts of the world that show up and disappear because, again, it's like about this little girl's experience. So it's a very interesting use of lighting because you can kind of tell it's like kind of a little bit dark, but there are some bits of bright color. So very, very interesting game that I highly recommend.
And it's interesting to notice like which parts are light and which parts are dark. Like, you know, the main character, you know, is very light pink dress, but you know the quote on the outside's kind of dark, like signaling, you know, stuff light on the outside, dark on the outside, and you know those little fine details are really what separates, you know, thoughtful games to just games.
Art. Another interesting thing actually is sound. So sound, as you probably all know, like heavily affects us, right? Like part of this convention is music, right? Like a lot of you probably enjoy music and audio experiences. Sound definitely changes how you perceive a game or anything else. So I actually have an example from a TV show that's pretty popular right now. So if you've ever listened to the X-Files theme, it's like in a very specific key, and if you change that key even a tiny bit, it changes the way that the song sounds, and it goes from sounding like a kind of
just
creepy
think about
sound.
how you feel when you hear
Let's see
it.
this works. So this is X-Files, right? Aliens. Government denies knowledge, right? Like scary and just uncomfortable.
And it's making, I've never even seen this show, and like my insides are like turning inside out, like, you know, all nervous and stuff.
Very creepy.
Yeah.
So when you change it to a major key, it starts sounding like this. You can do it.
You're frolicking in a field with aliens!
You will be successful. Lions roaming across the prairie. Like, it sounds so happy.
It just
like,
changes the mood entirely.
It's the same song, but just in a different key. So just like make sure you're keeping track of like the sound and just how that impacts the way that people are feeling, and make sure that any piece of sound in your game has meaning, because seriously, it makes a huge difference as you just heard and felt. Next. All right, so timing. Another really important thing in games is timing. You've probably seen lots of cutscenes, you've probably experienced lots of games in which you're like moving and running around. You might know how the pacing can kind of affect the experience. A really interesting game that I would suggest kind of looking at for pacing and how that can kind of affect an experience is Fez. So in Fez, you're playing as this tiny character, and it's also really got like great audio, so definitely just check it out as like an experience. But a lot of the times you're just kind of running around and like trying to jump between things. But then there's this one area that's actually like a secret area that you get to, and you have to kind of like slow down and move like step by step, jump by jump, and it really makes you kind of step back for a second and just think about the experience that you're having in this game. And that coupled with the audio, because it's actually timed to the audio, just makes it like an experience that's not really forgettable. So if you want to kind of have them think, or maybe you want to speed them up and kind of like, you know, make them feel excited, you just have to think about the pacing of your game and how people are actually going to move through it.
Maybe you want to make a Super Mario 64 level when you're jumping over lava and flame spits and, you know, that really anxiety-provoking music. Whereas, you know, Fez is like, the music is super chill and it's very like kind of almost like introspective in a way, you know, kind of like rotating and moving around. And while, you know, you do have this anxiety of, oh, I have to like jump off of these platforms before they disappear, you know, you're also thinking like, oh, I wonder, you know, what's next, or if I rotate this way, like, oh, there's a new platform, that's so interesting. So it definitely gives you some time to reflect and explore. And so pacing can definitely be used in a way that's like, oh, I gotta get through it quick, gotta survive, or make it a very like reflective and introspective experience.
Yeah, another great game to also check out on that note is Sword and Sorcery. I don't know how many of y'all have played it, but it's also a very interesting game that works well with pacing and sound, so check that out.
Definitely. And so one of the most interesting themes, I think, is subverting tropes. So, you know, we all know a trope is a theme that is commonly found in a video game. And, you know, in order to, you know, have like a common theme, but there are some games that really find ways to just turn those tropes upside down on their heads, such as Undertale, which I know as soon as I started playing and I ran into my first monster, I was like, oh, this is just like Pokemon, what are we doing? And then I see there are all these different options, you know, I'm like, oh, mercy, what does that mean? So I explore the act option and I can see, oh, I can actually make friends with, I forget what the airplane is called, and Sand, Pseudoplane, and Frogus, and all that. And, you know, it's a really interesting way to interact with monsters and enemies, you know, to actually make friends with them instead of cutting them up into little pieces, which is still definitely an option. But you could also flirt with them or try to give them a hug, or sometimes, you know, they doesn't want to be pet yet and you have to collect the, you know, just like in this level, you have to collect the green airplanes before you can act in an empathic and sympathetic kind of way. And so Undertale does a really fantastic job of kind of like taking the, you know, combining puzzles and problem solving and Pokemon, but also adding love and happiness and awesome music also.
Sparkles. Yeah, so just in terms of mechanics, for example, like it uses a lot of mechanics that people are used to, but there are other kinds of tropes that you can also kind of think about as well, like what are common themes and how can you use those in different ways? What are character types that people would expect and how can you kind of flip those on their heads, for example? So definitely think about, like it's good to definitely say like, oh, I want my game to be different, and we all want our games to be different, but also think about things that people have already done and how you can completely flip those over and make it an experience that's incredibly memorable because of that moment. Great. So now that we've gone over some tips, we're also going to talk about some next steps, some things that we think would be interesting to play, as well as some things that would be interesting to read.
Yep. So some really interesting games. You know, we talked about Sparks. It's a really interesting instructional CBT program. It's a really short game right now. I think gameplay is only about 5 hours or something like that. But it's going to be really cool to see people build off on, you know, those psychological principles into games that can be fun and also really helpful. The Sims 4 has been used in a lot of psychologist play therapy rooms. It's a really great way to talk about, you know, relationships and build social skills and stuff like that, and also creativity in terms of building the houses. And so that's a really cool game to check out, you know, to really critically look at. Portal 2, while it's also just like a fun game in general, there actually have been studies that show that it significantly improves your spatial skills compared to Luminosity, which is specifically made to improve your cognitive ability. So just skip those apps and just play Portal 2. It's a great game. Another great game which uses a whole different controller. The Journey to the Wild Divine uses biofeedback. And so essentially you have these electrodes attached to your fingers that keeps track of the electric skin response that your body, we're all outputting electricity, which correlates to the amount of anxiety that you may have. And so it's a really cool game that's used to teach mindfulness, meditation, which I know sounds like super new agey and whatnot, but there is research behind it, and it's really interesting stuff. And one last game that we didn't actually mention in terms of multiplayer games is League of Legends, which I know a lot of people are either love it or hate it. But it's a really interesting game to look at in terms of social behavior. And Riot Games have actually hired psychologists to try to figure out how to make their community less vitriol. And they've added mechanics to make people communicate in a more amiable way and also more effectively. Like, I don't know if you've ever noticed like the different types of pinging that you can do, like saying you're on your way or place a ward here or danger, danger, don't go there. You know, those are all informed by user research and psychologists that they hired. And so I would definitely suggest looking at those games when considering making games of your own.
Awesome. And a couple of my recommendations. Firstly, Journey is a really interesting game. Also very kind of like audio-visual as an experience. And just the idea that you're like roaming through these lands, communicating with other people that you can only communicate in a certain way is quite interesting of an experience. So definitely kind of check that out as like a human connection kind of game. Also, I mentioned That Dragon Cancer earlier. It just came out, and it's a very emotional experience, and people have cried after playing it. So definitely prepare yourself for tears, but definitely check it out because it's really, I think, an important game that's kind of leading the empathy game scene. Depression Quest, as I mentioned earlier, Contrast, and also another one is Sound Self, which is best played on the Oculus Rift. It's kind of like another audio-visual experience where you're kind of like breathing and just kind of seeing this interesting visual shape that's like changing. And so it's really about like the whole point of it is supposed to be kind of about breathing and this calm and kind of like hearing this noise. And it's supposed to like replicate this experience that people have. I believe. So it's a very interesting game to also to play if you get the chance, if you have an Oculus Rift or you know someone with one. But you can also check out videos of it as well. And just even listening to it is really interesting, and like watching the YouTube videos of Sound Self, super interesting. Some books to check out, and then Laura also has some great studies to recommend, as well as she's got like a ton of them. There are lots of them out there, but these are just two. So books to look at: The Art of Game Design is a really great game that kind of holistically talks about creating games, from things like just ideation to testing it, to all the other parts of making games. But they talk about a lot of user experience stuff in there, so I would definitely recommend looking at that, as well as Micro Interactions, which is actually a book that's focused on people who make apps and websites and things like that. But it's actually very interesting because it focuses on how interactions kind of change the way that people feel when they're using things. So kind of like those small interactions and how they can really affect the way that people, you know, like feel about a service or like the delight they feel.
Right, and there's also a lot of academic journals, and specifically that look at video games in neurobiology, video games in social psychology, video games in counseling and psychotherapy, journals that are dedicated to just talking about the interaction between video games and mental health. And a couple of studies I definitely recommend. The bottom one, Sexualized Avatars Leads to Women's Self-Objectification and Acceptance of Rape Myths, is a really fantastic article about how just like having a simple avatar can influence how people think about women's bodies and about rape myths acceptance. And there are also a lot of great meta-analyses out there that look at longitudinal relationships between various video games and the benefits that they have in terms of cognitive functioning. some really interesting stuff. So if you know a friend that is going to college, bother them, ask them to look at all the various databases. And there are also a lot of books about video games and psychotherapy.
Yeah, and if you're cheap or don't have a college friend, there are some of these studies that are available.
You can definitely get them for free some places, yeah. Always search for
name
PDF.
a PDF, but yeah, that is the state of our education system.
Yay!
Yay! Awesome. So that's basically all we have for you today. Hopefully this was helpful and interesting. Thank you so much for all of you coming. If you have questions, feel free to raise your hand and shout it out, or you can come up to us. Either one is totally cool. I see you in the back there.
Me?
Shout it.
One of the questions, since I do stuff with some mental disabilities, ADHD, depression, is there any type of games that have looked into these type of issues and such, besides depression, stress, and such, and everything? I know there are some games that dealt with anxiety, but are there other type of games that have dealt with these issues before?
So are there any games that specifically address ADHD and other mental health issues like that?
Yes.
Trying to think. I don't know too much about this, but I have heard from a colleague that there are some interventions that actually use brain waves, which I know again sounds like super pseudoscience-y and mad and new agey. I really don't know that much about it, but I do trust this colleague. And similarly, biofeedback as well is a really great way to teach people how to both emotionally regulate and behaviorally regulate. And so there's actually something I do know about. There's a really great game in which you're hooked up to one of these galvanic skin response machines, and you're driving a car, and the more anxious and distracted you are, the lower the control you have over this car is. I think it's called Ride to Go. I remember talking about it in another talk, but that's another game that kind of addresses anxiety as well as ADHD.
Yeah, there was one other game that I don't remember the name of right now, and the whole premise was that, you were a person who was depressed and you were tired of your workplace and things like that. I don't know if anyone else remembers the name of it. It came out a couple of years ago, and it was kind of like a role-playing style game where it was very dialogue driven. This is something, if I find out the name of it, I will definitely tweet it. But I don't remember what it's called right now. I just remember it came out a couple of years ago. So there are other people that are experimenting with these kinds of games, and they come up every now and then, for example, in the press. But I can't remember the name of it at the moment, unfortunately. I think that was it, yeah.
Actual sunlight.
Thank you.
Wasn't there that game where, they're oh no, this was something else I talked about, where, they're shooting at this, one of the bosses is, this homeless, black person or something, and, they're trying to, feel bad for the person, but in reality, it's totally backfired. I don't think I was talking to you about that, though. Nope. I don't know.
Yeah. It's a game where you play as a homeless individual. You have to make it 12 hours. You sleep in this center.
Maybe. I don't think so. Yeah, it's like this shooter where it's kind of post-apocalyptic, and you're trying to survive, and one of the final bosses is this homeless black woman. She's like, I just want food, and you're shooting her, and it's really awful. So I'm not really sure where that guy was going in terms of like trying to cultivate empathy for, you know, you the player that's trying to survive, or that person, and then but then like there are those tropes that like, you know, bosses are always like dark-skinned people, and like, so that might be an example. Can't think of another one.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that personally, when I've tested things, there have just been times where like it was either too heavy-handed or just not clear enough what was trying to be conveyed. And like, so for example, when I made this game with a couple of friends called 5 Stages, and it's about like the experience of going through grief after breaking up with someone. And there was this one stage that was about bargaining, and so like the whole point is that when you do what the other person asks you to do, you hurt yourself, but it wasn't clear enough a lot of the time, and so people were kind of like, what am I supposed to be doing here? Like, I don't get it, because it wasn't clearly enough being conveyed to them, and so we had to keep tweaking like the interface until it started to make sense, and eventually after like the 5th time of tweaking it, it started to like, the point started to be clear after we changed like what we were saying to people, and how we actually had to say like disobey before the event started. We had to actually make it clear that your HP was being removed, and we actually had to add feedback that said, yes, like do what I want you to do, for people to realize like, oh, I see what you're trying to get at there, and like I now understand why this mechanic makes sense in the context of this game. So that's kind of like a personal anecdote. I hope that kind of clarifies a little bit, but I definitely think there should be a lot more studies around these kinds of things.
Insanity is a very popular trope in games, and I know sometimes it's used to enable things, or where that's being seen to use it very lightly. I'm mostly thinking of the Alice series, of Alice and Alice Madness Returns, where he's crazy, so all this stuff happens. Whereas, I think we were talking today about controversial subject, I didn't see a lot of talk here about mental health, design depression.
So they explore different mental health needs. Right. Right. There actually is a really interesting game that I always forget what the title is. It's a war hero game that looks like Call of Duty, Spec Ops. I think that's a really fantastic, that very subtly describes PTSD, because as you're, you know, at the beginning of each level, you are descending. I don't know if that's a theme ever, but you are always descending into something, which could easily be described as like descending like into your mind, like becoming more introspective, becoming more isolated. And as you're going on and on in this game, in which you're, you know, just like your typical war hero, you start questioning, you know, is what I'm doing right, is what I'm doing wrong, you know, shooting into a crowded market filled with, you know, innocent civilians and children, and you start having flashbacks. And was actually a really great game also in New York at the Museum of Moving Image. If you look on their website, there's a really great game where you play as a man experiencing PTSD symptoms. He's a construction like builder on site, and as they're like blowing their site with dynamite, he starts having flashbacks to when he was in a Humvee and an IUD blew up his Humvee, and it's very you know, and you have like the auditory hallucinations and the flashbacks, and so that's another really interesting and informative game about personal experiences about PTSD. And so there definitely are a lot of games out there. In another talk I gave, I definitely talked about more games about mental health and video games. And so I guess this talk was, you know, a little bit of that and a little bit of design. And I hope that answers your question a little bit better. Yeah.
You mentioned Sparks, and it helps with SET. What is that exactly?
CBT?
CBT, that's it.
So cognitive behavioral therapy is one of the most widespread practices that addresses different like depression, anxiety. And so essentially the building blocks of CBT is that people have different like illogical thoughts, and that these thoughts turn into patterns, these patterns turn into that inform behaviors, and these behaviors inform thoughts, and it's kind of like this endless negative cycle that you go on. And what CBT tries to do is it tries to pretty much give their clients the tools to become their own therapists and to dissect these unhelpful thoughts into something that might be more constructive. I mean, I think it really depends. I mean, obviously, you know, there is such like too much of a good thing. There's definitely that. I think the media really likes to demonize video games and say any sort of exposure is bad. So I think just like anything, you know, you definitely don't want to hand your 9-year-old kid GTA 5 without any sort of or really at all. And you know, you want to talk to your kids about video games and say like, you know, this is what this is what's happening here, how it kind of relates to real life, and how it's not real life at all. And I mean, in terms of like, I don't really have like set hours.
Yeah, I think it kind of like varies by person, but there's also like age standards. So there's actually kind of like guidelines or like suggestions regarding how much screen time children should have in general. And so I would probably suggest like that parents go by that, but when people become adults, it's really like, depends on how much time they have and also like if they have any addictive tendencies. But if, you know, like as long as they're like using it in a healthy way, it's kind of like, it depends on person to person.
Right, so that's kind of like talking about also like exposure therapy a little bit. And so in exposure therapy, well, first you see where the client is at. You know, maybe they'll be able to actually see a spider in person before seeing a spider on a video screen, or give a talk to 3 people, or only give people a talk on a video screen. And so, you know, it really depends, you know. Typically, you want to be extremely gradual, depending on how severe the phobia is. And also, especially in this virtual reality therapy that's made by Virtually Better, you can change different things. So let's say, you know, I'm giving this talk to you guys. Let's say a bunch of people's cell phones start going off, or people are coughing or laughing, you know, or like screaming. And so those are different settings that you can make. You know, I can either, you know, you guys are a great audience, so you guys are making it real easy for us, or you can like turn up the difficulty and help, and you know, it's definitely get the anxiety going, and expose people that way. And then slowly over time, you know, you would find like real world environments to keep working on it. But yeah.
I was kind of great as far as child development. One of the big anti-video game arguments I've heard is that if younger kids are playing video games, it'll stunt their social growth and harder time interacting with other children at school and other places, because if you take them to the playground and they're really young, they are doing that. Unfortunately, do you think there are video games that either prove this right and do stunt social development, or video games that actually help the social development?
I think that's always a really interesting argument. Personally, like I was a kid who grew up around a lot of games, and my argument against that has always been there's like an entire group of games that encourage people to interact with each other, which are multiplayer games. So like a lot of games, not just video games, like do encourage people to kind of play together or talk with each other, and it's always interesting because games have actually been a way that I've met other people, which is, you know, I guess Magfest is also kind of an example of that, but games have always been a great medium for people in my life to communicate with each other and kind of collaborate and work together and learn a lot of different skills actually, so that's kind of like an anecdotal version of that. But
And I know, I think a lot of that argument is informed by social learning theory, you know, in that if you see violence, you will act out violence, or if you see this, you'll do that. And while that, I think real life experiences definitely play a role in that. I think if parents are active and are able to help their children distinguish, listen, this is a video game and this is very different from reality, that kids will have an easier time navigating those differences and be able to effectively communicate with their peers over time. And I think games can also be a very like unifying experience as well in terms of like multiplayer games or, you know, trying to figure out a strategy game together. And so I think it really depends on the age. You know, I've definitely seen a lot of parents like, you know, just toss their iPad at their 2 or 3-year-old and just have them like scroll through it all day. You know, I don't think that is particularly healthy.
But if they play it together, for example, then that's an example of a person learning that games are a thing that can be social. And so hopefully their association won't just be like, I should play this alone, but rather, oh, like I can use this to kind of communicate with other people. And also the nice thing about that is that they can later talk with people in the real lives. Anyone else have any questions? You.
This game now basically is called Private Dungeon, and it was like a stress meter, and you get to control your character, start developing kind of mental problem. I was just wondering about that, as a positive thing or negative thing, using it as a kind of punishment for not playing well.
I think it's a really cool mechanic. I've actually seen my boyfriend play it a lot, and I think it's really unique and interesting, and also has a lot to do with resources. You know, if you don't have enough fuel to light your torch, then you have to walk around in the dark, and you slowly go insane, which is very dramatic. But also, like, if you don't have, you know, the basic necessities that every human being should be entitled to, like food, water, and shelter, then, you know, you could start developing empathy for people who don't have that and don't have the mental resources to live a healthy life. And so I think it's a really cool mechanic, definitely. I thought there was one more hand. Is there anything for you that speaks in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, personally, I do wish that more mainstream games had that. Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of people who like find meaning within the games, but it's not like explicitly stated that that's like kind of the goal. So, yeah, I mean, I hope that more games start to do that in the future, especially like larger published games. This person seems to have an idea.
I'm cheating. I'm using ego wrappers. Ego wrappers work really good. Okay, Mega Man X does a really good job illustrating the concept of wishing and wishing. And it helps with that.
That's fair, yeah. And I mean, there's also an argument, and this isn't really like it's kind of emotional on a certain level, but if you kind of look at the Sonic the Hedgehog series, for example, it's kind of all about like conserving like energy and like just thinking about humanity as like a group of people that kind of like destroy the earth. And like the human character who's like, you know, the biggest, most well-known human character is like a person who is, you know, literally turning animals into robots and destroying the environment. So like in one way, for example, like that's kind of a really old example, but it's also kind of interesting if you kind of look at it analytically, what they're kind of trying to say about humanity and what we kind of do to other animals. Art. Any other questions? I see you.
Hi. So we've kind of been talking about two different things at the same time. Games for people who might have emotional difficulties or something, and games to help people who don't understand those individuals. So really depending on
who your market is, either people who might need help coping or people who might just need to understand it better. Where is the kind of overlap there? Like, do you think it's possible for a researcher to make both kinds of games, like in one game? Or how would you balance that?
Yeah, so, I mean, again, using Depression Quest as an example, but there are other games that, like games, for example, like Back Dragon Cancer. There are games for people to understand, but people can also play those games and understand that they're not alone. And that's why I think that empathy games as a medium and a group are really interesting, because the point of them is not just to say, hey, other people, this is what it's like, but they also say, person who is experiencing this thing, you are not the only person in the world experiencing this, you're not alone, and there are other people that are going through the same thing like you, and the whole point being there that hopefully by playing this game, they will feel supported. It might be kind of cathartic for them, for example. And there have definitely been times where I've played games where it's like, man, I've been through this thing, and by playing through it again, it kind of made me think a little bit about my own experience. So those kinds of games that are focused on empathy don't really just have to be about conveying the experience to people who have never tried it.
And it doesn't have to be super obvious as well. For example, when I was playing Portal 2, while it doesn't really talk about mental health and all of that, GLaDOS says a lot more things in that game that really make you question, am I strong enough? Am I smart enough to figure this out? Can I do this on my own? I don't know. And through, sheer blood, sweat, and tears for me, I was able to figure out those puzzles and do the thing. And I did the thing. Did it. And so I think even games very subtly, the subtle dialogue can really tap into different things for different people, and that those kinds of games, while one can be made definitely to cultivate empathy and another to cultivate connection, can really find an overlap.
Cool. Does anyone else have any questions, or are we pretty solid? I think we're good.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for coming, y'all. All right, we'll be around for another couple of minutes, and then we're gonna.
But then we're gonna go see Samus.
So. Samus is
but we'll be here.
Go see Samus.
Go see Samus. She's awesome.
Samus. Go line up now.
Right now. No, ask us questions.